The year is 1308. In the Grand Cathedral of Boulogne, a young 12-year-old French princess, Isabella, the daughter of the powerful King Philip IV, stands before an altar. Her destiny, and indeed the future of two great European kingdoms, rests on this day. She is to marry King Edward II of England, a man 12 years her senior. It is a union of two great houses, a diplomatic triumph designed to secure a fragile peace. Isabella is a royal prize, a symbol of a political treaty. But what began as a calculated alliance would descend into one of history's most dramatic and destructive royal marriages. I am Dr. Amy Boyington, and today we are going to investigate that disastrous marriage. It was a union poisoned by betrayal, favoritism, and eventually the ultimate act of revenge, a queen's hand turning it against her king. The marriage itself was a success from a diplomatic standpoint. The bride, Isabella, was known for her exceptional beauty and intelligence, a fitting match for a king. The groom, Edward II, was tall and handsome, a fine figure of a handsome man, as one contemporary described him. However, he was a king with a fatal flaw. Unlike his formidable warrior father, Edward I, Edward II had little interest in the traditional arts of kingship, such as warfare, jousting, or statecraft. He preferred simple things such as manual labour, rowing boats, thatching roofs, and a simple life that was the opposite to the nobility. More crucially, he was deeply attached to his long-time companion, Piers Gaveston. Piers Gaveston was a Gascon knight, witty, charismatic, and incredibly arrogant. He had been Edward's playmate and confidant since childhood. Their bond was, as one chronicler put it, a covenant of constancy, an indissoluble love. Historians have debated the exact nature of their relationship for centuries. Was it a homosexual one? Was Edward bisexual? Was he homosexual? We just don't know. But what we do know is that Gaveston was Edward's absolute favourite. Its political consequences, however, were undeniable and catastrophic. The cracks in the new royal marriage began to show almost immediately after the wedding. At the coronation feast in Westminster Abbey, just a few months after their vows, the new Queen of England was humiliated on a grand stage. The king's attention was not on her, but on his favourite, Gaveston. Chroniclers reported that Edward almost completely ignored his young bride, showering his favourite with gifts that were actually meant for the Queen. Gaveston, elevated to the earldom of Cornwall, a title normally reserved for a member of the royal family, was adorned in a magnificent purple robe, more splendid than those of the other nobles. He also carried the crown of St. Edward in the procession and sat next to the king, in a position of honour that should have been Isabella's. The French courtiers who had come to England with Isabella were absolutely shocked and appalled at Gaveston's behaviour and at the king's attitude towards him and his neglect of Isabella. Word went back to France of the goings-on at the English court, leaving her father incensed. For Isabella, this was more than a personal slight. It was a political insult of the highest order. She was a daughter of France, a symbol of a treaty, and she was being sidelined by a man the English nobility despised. The powerful barons, led by men like Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, saw Gaveston as a low-born upstart who was corrupting the monarchy. Gaveston's insolence was boundless. He gave the barons insulting nicknames and openly mocked them. He thought he was untouchable. He was, in the words of one contemporary, a second king who had usurped the royal authority and was alienating the very men Edward needed to rule. The barons, seething with a mixture of jealousy and political outrage, repeatedly forced Gaveston into exile. Edward, consumed by grief and anger, always found a way to bring him back. This cycle of banishment and return became a defining feature of the early years of Edward's reign, plunging the country into a state of near constant political crisis. The end of the Gaveston era, though, was as violent as it was inevitable. In 1312, after Gaveston's final return, the rebellious barons captured him. Despite Edward's frantic pleas, they executed him without a proper trial, running him through with a sword on a hill near Warwick. The king's grief was immense, and his rage against the men who had killed his favourite would fester for years, leading him to a dark path of vengeance. Edward's personal and political life was a catastrophe, but he had learned nothing from the Gaveston affair. His profound sense of loss and his desire for revenge against the barons who had killed his favourite led him to find him new allies. He turned to a father and son duo, Hugh Despenser the Elder and Hugh Despenser the Younger. They were far more ambitious and ruthless than Gaveston had ever been. The younger Hugh in particular was a man of insatiable greed and boundless ambition. The Despensers' rise to power was meteoric. Hugh the Younger became the king's chamberlain in 1318, a position that gave him unprecedented access and control over the monarch. He used this influence to acquire vast wealth and territories, particularly in the Welsh marches. Edward II, seemingly as infatuated with the Despensers as he had been with Gaveston, allowed them both to do as they pleased. The Despensers became the richest and most powerful men in England, and Edward's rule became, in effect, their own. For Isabella, this period was even more unbearable than the Gaveston years. Though she had borne Edward an heir by this point, the future Edward III, the king ignored her at every turn. The Despensers actively worked to poison the king's mind against his wife, viewing her as an obstacle to their total control. They humiliated her in a number of cruel and calculated ways. They seized her castles, her lands, and even her income, reducing her to a state of near poverty and forcing her to beg for money. Isabella's marriage to Edward was at breaking point. She was a queen, and she was being treated with contempt by her own husband and his favourites. They were openly hostile to her, and she had to contend with the fact that Despenser was, in effect, ruling the country in her husband's name. Most cruelly, in 1324, the Despensers reportedly took Isabella's 4 surviving children away from her, including her heir, the future Edward III. A mother's despair was used as a political tool to keep her under their control. The Queen, who had patiently endured her husband's neglect and the insults of his favourites for years, was now a humiliated and powerless figurehead. Her loyalty, strained for years, had finally reached its breaking point. Her marriage was no longer a personal tragedy, it was a political prison from which she needed to escape. But then, in 1325, with tensions in Gascony threatening to ignite a new war, Edward II made a fatal miscalculation. He sent Isabella and their heir on a diplomatic mission to her brother, King Charles IV of France, to negotiate a peace treaty. This was the opportunity that Isabella had been waiting for. Once in France, she publicly refused to return to England as long as the Despensers remained at her husband's side. And don't forget, she had the heir of England with her. During this time in France, she met Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron who had been a fierce enemy of the Despensers. Mortimer had led a rebellion against them, and after being imprisoned in the Tower of London, had made a daring escape to France in 1323. They were both powerful, intelligent, and driven by a deep-seated hatred for Edward and his favourites. Their alliance quickly blossomed into a romantic affair, with Mortimer providing the strategic mind and Isabella providing the royal connections. The she-wolf of France, as she would later be called, was born. Isabella and Mortimer together began to plot the unthinkable, the invasion of England and the overthrow of the king. To secure the legitimacy and the resources for their cause, Isabella arranged a marriage between her son Edward and Philippa, the daughter of the powerful Count of Hainault. This alliance provided them with the ships, money, and mercenaries they needed to launch their rebellion. Isabella, a woman who had been systematically oppressed and humiliated, was now an avenging angel. She was not just seeking to remove the Despensers, she was seeking to remove her husband from the throne. And so, in September of 1326, Isabella, Mortimer, and their army landed on the coast of England, as you can see here. They were met not with resistance, but with popular acclaim. The country was fed up with the tyranny of the Despensers and the perceived incompetence of Edward II. The king's support crumbled almost instantly. London rose up in support of the Queen and the Despensers, and the king were forced to flee. Despensers were captured and met a horrific end. Here you can see them kneeling before Isabella. Hugh Despenser the Elder was hanged in his armour. His son Hugh Despenser the Younger was put on trial with Isabella and Mortimer in attendance. He was found guilty of treason and subjected to a gruesome execution. He was dragged through the street, hanged on a 30-foot gallows, then drawn and quartered, a public spectacle that gave the populace a cathartic release from his years of tyranny. Edward II was now on the run. He had been abandoned by his subjects, and he was soon captured by his wife. He was taken to Kenilworth Castle, where a parliament was called to depose him, with his son, the future Edward III, being declared the new king. Edward II was forced to abdicate, a shocking act of regicide in all but name. For a short time, Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents over England, wielding the power of the throne to Isabella's young son. But as long as Edward II lived, he remained a threat to them. The circumstances of his death, therefore, are one of history's most enduring mysteries. The official story was that he died of natural causes at Berkeley Castle. However, a popular and persistent account, which captured the public imagination for centuries, claims that he was murdered in a particularly horrific way, with a red-hot poker being inserted into his body through his butt. It was a gruesome and fittingly dramatic end for a king whose reign was so defined by personal tragedy and political violence. Isabella's reign, however, as regent would be short-lived. Her son, Edward III, now a young man, grew to resent the power of Mortimer and his mother. And in 1330, he staged his own coup, arresting Mortimer at Nottingham Castle. Mortimer was quickly tried and executed for treason. The she-wolf of France was now stripped of her power and her lover. She was exiled from court and lived out her days in honourable captivity. The marriage of Edward II and Isabella of France was a tragedy born of political necessity and personal incompatibility. It was a story of a king's fatal flaw, a queen's immense pride, and the destructive power of personal relationships in the highest echelons of power. It's a story that proves that even in the halls of royalty, love, betrayal, and revenge can change the course of history forever. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this, please do like, share, and comment, and watch out for more videos as I'll be posting weekly.